Welcome to all of you to John Jay. If this is your first time here, and for students, a particular welcome, faculty and staff. My name is Jeremy Travis, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this kickoff event in what will be a semester-long series of events on issues of immigration and deportation. So I'd like to take a moment, if you would allow me, just to talk about why we do such things here at John Jay, and to link this to some other similar initiatives. So John Jay is a wonderful institution with lots of variety of interest, people who think about important issues through different lenses and different perspectives. But there's a tendency in this organization, like there is in many organizations, for us to sort of retreat to our corners, care about only what we care about, and not really look at bigger pictures. So from time to time, the college will sponsor semester-long initiatives like this one to engage our students and our faculty and our friends from around the city in a theme. So we've done this last semester. Those of you who are here at the college know we did this last semester, a series of events called Remembering Newtown, to think about the issues of gun violence and school safety and the like. And that was ended with a very memorable and moving ceremony in honor of the victims of Newtown. We did that a year before, a similar event a year before called Understanding Islam, which really grew out of the events at the mosque at Ground Zero, trying to assist our community in thinking more broadly and expansively about issues involving Islam and the Muslim faith and integration of those communities into the larger American fabric. And then before that, we did a series of events, semester-long events on torture. And if you were here, you'll remember that. It arose out of the Abu Ghraib revelation. So sometimes these events are triggered by events in our nation's history, as you see from those examples. This one is similarly sort of tied, I think, to some of the discussions underway at the sort of national level and at the local level on immigration policy. If you follow this nationally, there's some movement in Washington, slow movement, I would say, maybe non-movement, maybe backward movement, but at least a discussion about immigration policy, and we want to be part of that. But we bring a particular focus to this larger conversation, which is this focus on deportation, which is, in my view, here's a personal statement, not getting enough attention in this larger discussion about immigration policy and the intersection of immigration policy and criminal justice policy. So that's sort of where we live here in New York at John Jay. So that's the genesis of this idea, and we have a number of faculty that we thank for bringing this to the fore, and we have in particular the staff who have made this work, Dan Stageman, who you hear from a second, Bettina Munster in my office, who have sort of organized this series of events. So if you don't already have the flyer that looks something like this, called Immigration and Deportation Initiative Fall 2013, please get it. It's also on our website, a very nice website we've created for this, that creates a number of opportunities for us to look at these issues through a number of different lenses. And we particularly encourage our students to come and to really understand these issues as policy questions, as research questions, as spoken word questions, as theatrical questions, and as political questions, organizing questions. So please, 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 if this is your topic, don't come just today, come to one or more of these events throughout the semester. So there's the commercial. That's the commercial announcement while I have the microphone. So this is the kickoff event in that semester-long series of events on deportation laws and their local impact. We have a wonderful panel that has gathered with a substitution that we'll tell you about in a second, of people who have thought deeply and in an extensive sort of way about these issues, and we encourage you to connect with them after this event today. And my sole task is to welcome you and to introduce Dan Stageman, who will be the moderator and the MC for the event. But I do want to make a special announcement, just to say I'm very grateful that our Commissioner of Corrections for New York City, Dora Schriro, is here. You'll see in a moment that she has a very long-standing connection to the deportation issues and was asked by our Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, to take a close look at these issues on behalf of the Obama administration when they were taking office. And her work, her report that she produced continues to stand as guidepost for how we should think differently about the deportation and the detention issues. So we're very honored that Commissioner Schriro is with us here today. So I will step aside and invite Dan Stageman to the microphone, who will introduce the panel and the panelists and get us started. And I wish I could be here for everything, but I'll be here for a bit to hear the discussion. And I thank you all for coming, and keep coming. Thanks.
So I'd like to thank President Travis, of course, for introducing this event today. As he said, I am Dan Stageman. I'm the Director of Research Operations here at the college. And as President Travis said, this is the inaugural event of our semester-long series on immigration and deportation. This event in particular is a great way to kick off this series because half of this series is about deportation. Deportation is one of the issues that doesn't receive maybe enough attention as part of the attention that surrounds immigration and the immigration legislation that's being considered in Congress. This is not a distant issue for many here at John Jay. John Jay College is a community of immigrants. Close to half of our students are first-generation immigrants or the children of first-generation immigrants. So this is an issue that is near and dear to the hearts of many of our students and our faculty as well. And it is something that many of our students and faculty may have had first or second-hand experience with. I'd just like to thank a few people before we begin the event for the organization that they put into this, and that would be Bettina Munster, Coordinator of Special Projects in the President's Office, and her interns, who also happen to be the officers of our brand new Dreamers Club here at John Jay College. And they are Mehdi Mahroui, and you'll have to excuse me if I mispronounce anyone's names, Sabrina Pastel, and Irvin Balazon. So thank you to those individuals for helping us organize this event. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'm just going to go through the biographies that hopefully each of you has in hand. We will start with Commissioner Dora Schriro of the New York City Department of Correction. Commissioner Schriro is a nationally recognized innovator in reentry and the only person in the nation to have led 4 correctional systems. Dr. Schriro was appointed to direct New York City's 12,500 inmate jail system by Mayor Michael Bloomberg on September 21st, 2009. Immediately prior, she had served as Special Advisor to Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano on Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Detention and Removal, and was the founding director of the Office of Detention Policy and Planning at Immigration and Customs Enforcement. In that role, she directed work on the department's plan to overhaul the nation's immigration detention system. The department released that report and its plans for reform in October 2009. And of course, that is in many ways the definitive report on immigrant detention and the way that it is carried out in this country. Previously, Commissioner Schriro served for 6 years as the director of the Arizona Department of Corrections, from 1993 to 2001 as director of the Missouri Department of Corrections. In each state, she was the first woman selected to lead the agency. Commissioner Schriro also served as warden and then commissioner of the St. Louis City Division of Corrections. Among her volunteer activities, Dr. Schriro also serves as commissioner on the ABA Commission on Immigration, as well as a commissioner on the Women's Refugee Commission. Next up is Alina Das on the left. Alina is an assistant professor of clinical law and co-director of the Immigrants' Rights Clinic at the NYU School of Law. She and her students represent immigrants and community organizations in litigation at the agency, federal, and Supreme Court level, and in immigrant rights campaigns at the local, state, and national level. Professor Das engages in scholarship on deportation and detention issues, particularly at the intersection of immigration and criminal law. She is the recipient of a number of awards that you can go through if you want to read this. Prior to joining NYU, Professor Das was a Soros Justice Fellow and a staff attorney with the Immigrant Defense Project, and served as a law clerk for Kermit V. Lipez of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. She's a graduate of Harvard, NYU Wagner, and the NYU School of Law. Marianne Yang was not able to be here today because of an emergency, but the Brooklyn Defender Services will be represented by Talia Peleg, who is a staff attorney in the immigration unit at Brooklyn Defender Services. She joined BDS in 2009 as a legal intern, and as a staff attorney, she now represents clients in their immigration matters in removal proceedings and before USCIS in adjustment of status, U visa, and other affirmative applications. She earned her JD from CUNY Law School, so she is a product of our very own CUNY system, and her BA from Vassar College in 2004. While at CUNY Law, Talia participated in the Immigrant and Refugee Rights Clinic, where she worked on appellate-level advocacy for a non-citizen who had been designated an enemy combatant by the U.S. government and detained for over 8 years at Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan. And finally, Angela Fernandez, who is the executive director of the Northern Manhattan Coalition for Immigrant Rights. Angela is a graduate of Columbia University Law School who has 20 years professional experience in law, media, nonprofit management, government policy development, and advocacy. Her public interest law experience includes working with the Center for Human Rights Legal Aid in Cairo, Egypt, and providing pro bono legal services through the American Immigration Lawyers Association. She's also successfully founded and managed elementary schools in the South Bronx and in Washington, D.C., along with a host of other experiences, including media experience as an off-air reporter for ABC News, World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, and writing weekly column on immigration matters for El Diario La Prensa, the most widely read Spanish language daily in the Northeast. And with those introductions aside, I'd like to allow our panelists first to introduce themselves a bit further and tell you a little bit about what they do in their organization and how their organization interacts with immigrants throughout the legal process, particularly pertaining to detention. And if we can go through in the order in which we're listed in the program. So we can start with Commissioner Schriro, followed by Alina, followed by Talia, and finally Angela. Thank
you. Good afternoon, everyone. So just to summarize my introduction, I'm a jailer, and I'm a recidivist, as you heard, because I go from place to place, and I keep coming back for more. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the department and our roles and responsibilities when it comes to detention and recognizing or not recognizing ICE detainers in the latter part of my remarks, so I'll ask you to save that for a couple minutes. My charge is to give you a bit of an overview or an introduction to today's conversation, an extremely important conversation, and I'm really very pleased to do that. I'm going to start where there was a shift in policy during the Bush administration, where the long-standing practice under INS, which is the precursor to ICE, as many of you know, shifted from a policy of what was called catch and release to catch and remove. Not the nicest expression, but one that was widely used at the time for both apprehending those who had either come or remained in an unlawful manner and then were released right back into the community, to a shift where they were apprehended with the primary focus on being removal, being returned to their home country. And so with just the flip of a switch, the civil detention system, which was 8 facilities and a total of some 4,000 beds, grew in no time at all to being in excess of 300 facilities around the country and more than 34,000 beds that were filled at any point in time. Now, the last figures indicate that the number of foreign-born individuals who are being held for civil purposes, not criminal purposes, exceeded 400,000 last year. And that makes ICE the largest system of incarceration in the United States, larger than the Bureau of Prisons, larger than state systems such as California, Texas, New York, Illinois. It makes this the single largest system in the country. And certainly until Secretary Napolitano came into office, and then I had the great fortune of being tapped to try to document what civil detention looked like, and most importantly, what could be done about it. There was very little that was known about the manner in which individuals were apprehended and held pending determinations of either removal or relief. Now, I want to just summarize very briefly in giving you some framework for today some of the, not profound necessarily, but significant findings from that work, because I think it speaks loudly about some of the challenges that we face, whether there are going to be statutory changes or not in the next several years, and it looks more like not than so. So let me start first with the law, because this is an important place to begin. As a matter of law, immigration detention is unlike civil incarceration. And I'll give you a couple examples. ICE, as a matter of law, cannot incarcerate an alien for a criminal violation. Its authority is solely administrative. ICE can only detain an alien during the removal process, which is a civil proceeding conducted exclusively in the civil courts. And civil detention can never be used for the purpose of punishment. And that one's perhaps the most important when you think about all the news coverage, because it's all about, they focus on crime and they focus on punishment, and that is expressly not the purpose of either being held or supervised in the community or released on your own recognizance in the community when it comes to these civil matters. So despite these black letter differences, the man on the street, the folks that you ordinarily would speak with, sees an immigrant detainee and a criminal inmate as one and the same. And this confusion goes to a lot of other beliefs that people have. For example, that if you're being addressed as an alien, that you have a right to Miranda warning. Miranda warnings only apply in criminal proceedings. And so anyone can approach you and anyone can ask you any question, and whatever you have to say, whether or not you've been given any notice at all, can and indeed be used to make a determination as to whether or not you are subject to removal. Likewise, there is no right to publicly funded counsel for individuals who are being held or examined for civil proceedings, and this is also a very important distinction. Now, the confusion comes in part because of the places where civilly held individuals are placed, and they are, almost without exception, jails and prisons, largely jails. Many of those jails are operated by sheriff's departments, and a significant number of them are operated by the private sector, by private prison companies as well. And everything about the manner of the incapacitation is from the world of criminal justice and is based on the premises of individuals who are charged with violations of criminal law, individuals who represent risk to the public from a criminal justice perspective. And there are some real important differences, of course, between the populations beyond the basis for their apprehension. And that is that the majority of detained aliens, as many of you in the audience know from your own experiences, they enjoy intact families. They have successfully maintained homes, taken care of themselves and their families, and have been gainfully employed prior to their apprehension. And for those who are being held for civil reasons and have some criminal record, it is quite different from those that I would encounter in jail or prison systems such as the ones that I have run or am running now. About half have no criminal record at all. And of those who do, fewer than 1 in 10 has committed a crime that you would refer to as a UCR, a Uniform Crime Report type of offense. And in fact, the vast majority of them, their records are for traffic violations and low-level drug offenses and larceny. So that's what their criminal record looks like. And yet when you listen to the debate in Congress and elsewhere, they talk about the worst of the worst, the most dangerous of the most dangerous. And in fact, based on the classification system that ICE itself operates, the vast majority of these individuals who are in ICE custody are assessed to be by ICE itself as low risk or minimum security individuals. And yet they continue to be managed by ICE through its detention standards under the very traditional principles of command and control. And so all of the premises that you see in jails and prisons, you will see with several now exceptions. There are 6 jails or 6 facilities that have been created since the reform started that start to move in the direction as what a civilly operated system of civil detention might look like, and that today is part of our conversation. There are several things that I think need to be done, and now I'm going to go from some very specific findings to some pretty big observations about the capacity currently within ICE to operate a civil system of civil detention, and in the process to talk to you a little bit about what that might be. So first, what would a civil system be? And that will be some of today's conversation, of course. It would be that at the very least, that the conditions of detention, the way in which you live your life, what the quality of your life would be while being under ICE's authority, would at the very least meet, if not exceed, the constitutional or minimum standards that have been enumerated largely in case law for a criminally held population. There's just no reason that someone held exclusively for civil violations of law should be subject to conditions that are less than, and many would argue should be better than, those to which criminal inmates are entitled. That the standards that ought to be adopted should not necessarily be those that were promulgated by ICE, because ICE's standards are based on standards that were generated by the American Correctional Association for criminal pretrial prisoners and criminally pled or proven guilty individuals who are actually serving a sentence. And keep in mind again that, of course, for the civilly held, they are expressly not held for the purpose of punishment. But nor is it a question of being innocent or guilty, as one would ask in criminal matters either. That when control is necessary, so for that small segment who may have a criminal history that would connote some risk of flight or propensity for violence, that is the likelihood that they would hurt another a fellow inmate or other person in the system, or the likelihood of rearrest if they were released, that for the vast majority, the risk that they present is minimal, and so that the level of control that would be applied should always be proportionate to the risk that they present, which again is little to none. And so the assessment should be objective, and the strategies should be aligned to the profile of this population, individuals who are largely successful with minimal to no supervision when left to their own devices on the street. And so think about how prisons and jails are operated, where it's everything is top-down management, where all decisions are made for that population by the administration. And here, to afford them opportunity, some freedom of choice, freedom of movement, freedom of expression in a wholly differently designed facility. And so in essence, to look for a system that is to the greatest extent possible normalized, where people would live their lives under the authority of the government with the least amount of intrusion possible. And that to ensure that these things happen, that there be vigorous oversight of any provider, whether it be a sheriff's department or a private prison operator. But in no case is it actually ICE itself that's running any of these facilities, and that these expectations should be legislatively mandated and fully funded so as to ensure that these constitutional measures are always adhered to. I'm just going to move real fast to what New York City is looking like, and then we'll leave it to our other colleagues. Here in the city, we've made great efforts to harmonize a variety of city policies in the context of the immigration reform discussion. In the New York City Department of Correction, about 14% of our ADP, that's our average daily population, is foreign-born. And there's a long-standing mayor's executive order that encourages collaboration and cooperation between all law enforcement agencies. Of course, when that MEO was first promulgated, it was well in advance of the ICE enforcement activities. And so that's been revisited and reformed as well. First, on behalf of the department, recognizing the no Miranda part of today's conversation, we have severely restricted ICE's movement within our jail facilities. And ICE agents must wear an identifiable uniform and present a credential, and they may not, of their own accord, interact with anyone in our population. They make a request of the department, a desire to interview an inmate in our custody. That inmate is afforded the opportunity to accept the request, to deny the request, or to postpone the request until they have an attorney, if they have an attorney of their own on immigration matters, to assist them with that conversation. Beyond that, our city council and the mayor have enacted 2 now local laws that further restrict our recognition of detainers that ICE imposes. And one of the most important advances, and not so widely publicized, is ICE's own acknowledgement that its detainer does not have the same effect as a warrant does. And so it is that you're going to see increasingly more of these local initiatives. The state of Connecticut just adopted almost virtually the local laws that were established here in New York City, San Francisco, and several other states. Newark just announced over Labor Day that they were adopting similar practices as well. And so in all things, you're going to see some changes. Now, I mentioned that about 15% of our population is foreign-born. Of those admissions that come in a year, and there were about 12,000 admissions last year. Although we're 12,000 people a day, over 80,000 admissions a year, because as jails, people don't stay very long. There were fewer than 3,500 of those 12,000 admissions that had detainers placed or a detainer already in place who were in our custody. And of those who had detainers and were available for release, 60% or some 2,000 were turned over to ICE. And so these are individuals who were in that smaller group that I described to you, who's had criminal charges of some consequence, and or had other characteristics that have been determined to be a threat to the community. So they were on a known terrorist watch group, or were on a organized threat group, which is fancy talk for gangs. And so as this law goes into effect, we're seeing fewer detainers being placed on our population. We're seeing ICE acting on fewer of the detainers that they place, but at the end of the day, there's still some 2,000 that are still being turned over. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, first of all, to Bettina and Dan and everyone here at John Jay for inviting us and for focusing on what is an incredibly important issue, not only because of the debate that's happening nationally, but because of all of the issues that the Commissioner just described that have been going on in New York City for a very long time. My name is Alina Das. As Dan stated, that I am a professor at NYU Law School, and I co-direct our Immigrant Rights Clinic. I'm just going to give you a brief picture of the work that we do, since I know there'll be a chance for more discussion over the course of this panel. So the Immigrant Rights Clinic represents both immigrants and organizations on immigration, immigrant rights issues. So what does that mean? That means that our students are working with individuals who are facing the deportation and detention system that the commissioner just described, as well as working with community organizations to try and change that system. And that's because the laws on the books are very, very bad. They're bad as written, and they're interpreted very badly by the courts. So we are constantly pushing the law by helping our clients navigate the system, representing them in immigration court, trying to get them out of detention, to challenge the ways the laws are currently interpreted. But at the end of the day, those laws are there, and if in order to make fundamental change, there has to be a process, and that can be legislative. It can be work on the ground to push people to make changes. And it goes down to the question that the commissioner just highlighted so well in terms of what the purpose of immigration, deportation, and detention really is. I mean, it seems like an obvious question with an obvious answer, but if you think about it in the context of individuals, it really becomes perplexing. One example of a client that we've represented recently is a woman who came here to the United States as a child. She was 6 years old. She lived over 40 years of her life here. In the course of growing up in New York, she had come across hard times. At one point, she had been homeless. She had been involved in a domestic violence situation. And during the course of that time, she developed a drug addiction. As a result of those hardships, she did receive several convictions and was eventually put in contact with a criminal justice organization that focused on reentry, was finally given the services that she needed to overcome that addiction, and was able to, after a very long and hard road, be able to get clean, to get a job, to be able to afford an apartment where her and her daughter lived, and was living the life that she had really struggled for a long time to have here in New York. And it was maybe a year and a half after she had finished rehabilitation and gotten an apartment and her life back together when there was a knock on the door. Apparently, the last time she had been in jail, the local officials at that jail had given her information to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they had, in going through their books over time, identified her as somebody who was deportable based on those past convictions. And so it was at that stage, a year and a half later, that they picked her up. They transferred her miles away to a county jail in New Jersey, which is where most New Yorkers, when they are apprehended here, end up, if they're not detained even further, to facilities in Alabama, Louisiana, Texas. But she was transferred far away. The apartment, which was in her name, her daughter was evicted. She found herself in jail without many of the services that she had worked hard to achieve, and facing deportation to a country she had never been to in the last 40 years. So that's what our deportation and detention system looks like. It looks like people who have been American in every way other than the papers, who are facing the loss of everything they know, often many years after any sort of incident they may have had with the law, whether that's somebody who came here and lost their status and is undocumented, or a person who does have immigration status but is not yet a citizen and thus subject to potential detention and deportation because of a criminal record. And so if you look at the picture of this woman, the question, again, is what does deportation and detention policy serve? Is it a public safety issue? Does it actually create more problems than it solves? At that point in time, before deportation got mixed into the picture, this woman was living her life, she was working hard, she was supporting her daughter, she was living in her own apartment, and she had achieved a level of self-sufficiency like any other American would in their own communities. But it was the deportation system that disrupted that caused her to lose her home, that resulted in thousands of taxpayer dollars to keep her detained in a county jail for months until students in our clinic were able to secure her release. And eventually, she was one of the lucky few that, thanks to free legal services, because the government doesn't provide it, was able to convince a judge that she was eligible for some form of relief, some type of hearing in the immigration system where a judge could decide whether or not she should face deportation. And she was ultimately granted that waiver and allowed to stay in the U.S. With her lawful permanent residency. But for most individuals in this situation, the laws don't even allow that form of relief, that day in court, that basic right that you would imagine the American system of justice would provide for people. So that's the system that we're working with. So in addition to representing women like the client I just described, we represent organizations in their campaigns. And those are campaigns that can be involved in trying to craft legislation to fight for some of the inclusions and due process provisions that we want to see in the law. It can also include working with communities to educate the public, to organize, because the kind of lasting change we want to see is a change that every person can support. We often find that when people think about deportation and detention policies, they, again, mix these issues with traditional criminal justice issues, thinking about, what is actually going to solve crime or prevent these problems. But at the end of the day, public safety is better served when families can stay together, when these are the types of issues that a judge can consider before decisions as drastic as deportation and detention are made. So those are the kinds of issues that we work on in our clinic to both help people navigate the legal system and to change the law. And I look forward to answering more of the questions that I know our moderator will be presenting as the panel goes on.
Thank you so much to the organizers and John Jay for hosting this really important conversation, and thank you so much to all of you for taking out these 2 hours in your afternoon to be here for such an important conversation. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. Just to talk about Brooklyn Defender Services and the lens that I'm coming at this issue from, we are the one of 2 public defender providers in Brooklyn. We represent 40,000 individuals a year, all of whom are indigent criminal defendants on all kinds of cases, from low-level offenses, violations, having an open container, not paying for a subway fare, to serious level felonies. And of those 40,000 cases, we've estimated that about 20% of our clients are non-citizens, either on here without lawful status or lawful permanent residents or students or on some sort of immigration status having permission to live and sometimes work in the United States. So our role at Brooklyn Defender Services, we provide holistic defense services to each and every one of our clients. And that can mean very different things for different people. We have, on staff, we have attorneys who do defense for family court cases such as abuse and neglect proceedings, but I'll focus on the immigration unit, which is the unit I come from. And our job is focused squarely on the issues we're talking about today. My position and our work was created as a result of a Supreme Court decision in 2010 that came down that was called Padilla versus Kentucky, which essentially said, unfortunately for the first time, shockingly for the first time, that a criminal defendant that is a non-citizen in the United States has the right to understand what the immigration consequences are of a criminal case in our criminal justice system. It seemed to me as when I was in law school that this would be a principle that would have been accepted prior to 2010, but that was never definitively the law until 2010. And as a result, throughout the country, and New York City has been innovative on this as they have on other matters, have been creating immigration departments within the public defender system to ensure that our non-citizens are actually getting adequate representation. So my work is to try to, as Commissioner Schriro and Professor Das have talked upon, about the consequences of criminal contact can be so great, from detection into the immigration, leading into actually being placed physically into the immigration system, as far as receiving, also being convicted of something that could lead to incredibly harsh, disproportionate consequences, such as mandatory detention for a low-level offense, or possible mandatory deportation with no chance of any defense whatsoever, depending on what you were convicted of. So my work in the immigration unit is to work very closely hand in hand with the defense attorney on how to resolve the criminal matters that our clients may face in a very specialized way that could preserve their ability to fight to be able to stay in the United States. So some of my work may be trying to resolve the case in a way that could avoid that person entering into the immigration system, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And some of it could be resolving the case in a way that they remain eligible to keep their green card, they remain eligible to stay in the United States with their family, they remain eligible for the DREAM Act, or whatever it is that they are seeking in this country. I just wanted to focus on one other point. Commissioner Schriro did a wonderful job laying out how the detention system, the immigration system works, and who in fact is being detained and how they're being detained. I just wanted to focus for a moment on the immigration court system to expand a little bit upon what both the prior panelists spoke about, and that's really about the treatment of individuals if they are placed into immigration removal proceedings. And there are specific laws, mandatory detention laws, that were enacted in 1996 as part of the last time there was a large shift in immigration laws in the United States. And not only are the people who are being, so very, very, very low level offenses that I think most people would agree could subject someone to being in mandatory detention while they fight their case. For example, some individuals, depending on their immigration status, a simple marijuana possession could be enough to mean you cannot get out to fight your case. Something simple like 2 convictions for not paying for a turnstile, for jumping the turnstile, could be enough to make you lose your green card, even if you have been subject to losing your green card, even if you've lived and worked here for, as in the case that Alina gave, 40 plus years. So the proportionality, when we're talking about this, is you should really think about what our laws are punishing and saying are proportionate consequences for certain conduct that is labeled criminal. So just to lay out that context, that in the court, as an attorney actually fighting the immigration case, we're very limited in what we can actually do for people because the laws are so harsh and so severe in what the consequence can be of even a very, very minor criminal contact. So we'll go on more as the questions proceed, but that's a little bit about the work that we do at Brooklyn Defender Services. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Angela Fernandez, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Manhattan Coalition for Immigrant Rights. Thank you, John Jay College, for hosting us, and thank you to all of the panelists for setting up the scene for myself to be able to talk a little bit more about what we do. We're a community-based organization that was founded 30 years ago by members of the community who felt a real need for culturally competent immigration services. And we're located in Northern Manhattan at a time where there was a large influx of immigrants from the Dominican Republic. And the services that were provided were focused on citizenship and naturalization, ESL, citizenship classes. Then, as I would like to say, our organization serves like the canary in the coal mine. 1996 happened, as Talia just mentioned, and the immigration laws shifted. And what happened was it limited the control that immigration judges have in their own courtroom. It expanded the category of mandatorily deportable offenses. So what that meant was for our community, people who came to this country as young children with green cards, who were growing up at a time in the 80s and the 90s, in the middle of the drug war. You ended up having many youth getting arrested and taking plea deals because that's what they were advised to do. Mind you, this is pre-1996. After 1996 happened, we ended up having individuals coming into our office and saying, they have some kind of contact or interaction with immigration, and their past conviction ends up placing them into mandatory detention and deportation. For example, if they went to go apply for citizenship. And that created a huge crisis in the community. And that's when the organization had to shift its work, or actually expand its work, and started partnering with deportation defense organizations like Legal Aid so that we could provide these services. And today, we still continue to do that. Since 1996, I mean, this crisis just continues. And so along with that, the organization decided to also then focus on not just serving the individuals who are being impacted in this way, but also in identifying ways in which the legislation could be changed or policies could be changed. And that's where partnerships with, for example, the NYU Legal Clinic came in very well. For example, the wonderful change that actually happened at ICE at Rikers that Commissioner Schriro spoke about, limiting ICE's movement inside Rikers Island. Well, that was because the clients that were coming into NMCIR, the clients that were calling into another organization called Immigrant Defense Project, the clients that were coming into Families for Freedom were saying this is what's happening. And so thanks to that kind of organizing and partnering with the law school, we were able to identify ways in which we communicate with the city and say this is a problem, something that they may not even have been aware of, that this is a problem, and it was addressed. So we're grateful to that. But I don't want it to be missing in the equation that you must have that impact on the community and have the community have the ability to organize and address these issues. So the latest campaign that we're working on is actually in ensuring that detained immigrants who cannot afford an attorney actually have access to a high-quality free attorney. When the consequence is deportation and permanent separation from your family and your community where you may have been in for your entire life, we think that you should have a right to an attorney, because the study that the Katzman Group put together over 2 years, which the university is involved. I know Brooklyn Defenders is part of the Katzman study group. The study was incredible. What it said was that when a detained immigrant has to fight their case without an attorney, their chances of prevailing, someone can tell me, who can imagine the chance of an immigrant fighting against the U.S. government for their deportation, against, defending their deportation case? What's the chance of prevailing? What percentage? Oh, you guys have already been reading the literature. Okay, well, that's good. That means that it's out there. And when they do get an attorney, the chances of prevailing increase by 1,000%. I mean, the difference is astounding. And so we can talk about this maybe a little bit more later, because we have been doing research on also the cost of pulling someone out of their community. What does that cost to the state, the city, and to the family members as well? And so we can talk about that a little bit more. I want to stay brief so that we can actually have a conversation about this. Thank you.
So just so you all know, a bit of a plug here, Angela mentions the Katzman Study Group. You may not be familiar with that. Judge Katzman is now, I believe, the chief judge of the State Appeals Court, the Federal Appeals Court here in the Southern District of New York, if I got that right? Second Circuit. He spearheaded a study group that looked at representation, the right to legal representation for immigrants facing deportation cases. He's actually going to be speaking here on that subject in December, so if you take a look at the program for the entire initiative, he's one of the last events in the initiative. But I just want to move briskly through the process. We've kind of gotten a good idea of what each of the panelists does and what their role is, what their organization's role is. But what about the process itself? And just to move briskly through this, I'd like to just open this up. We don't have to do this in a particular order. I'd like panelists to sort of speak if they feel strongly about this. But in your experience, what are the most common ways in New York City that potential deportees enter this legal process? Alina, you mentioned an anecdote about a woman who faced a knock on the door due to past criminal convictions. Angela, you mentioned the impact of previous plea deals, but what are the really most common ways that you see immigrants who are deportable entering this legal process?
Tali, you want to talk about that? Sure. I can just start from the number one, as you probably gathered from what each of us have said, is the criminal justice system. And I want to talk a little bit about, who here has heard of secure communities? Can you raise your hand? It's also known as SCOM. That's sort of, I'll use that jargon. That's sort of how we describe it in my office. Secure Communities was an initiative by the Department of Homeland Security that initially, when it's essentially a fingerprint sharing database where fingerprints are shared with the Department of Homeland Security from local officials. You may be able to speak to this better, Commissioner, but if you'd like to jump in.
Will you just do 2 seconds?
Sure, yeah.
We'll help each other out here. So they talk about interoperability. When you're arrested, it's in a local police department or sheriff's department, and whatever jurisdiction that is, it's then fed into a state database. And initially what ICE attempted to do was to broker agreements or MOUs between either local departments or with state agencies. And so New York City, for example, was prepared to opt out, and then there was discussion at the state level whether we were going to opt in or opt out. But ultimately, all of the individual state databases are fed into the federal system. And so ICE just skipped over all the states, or Homeland Security skipped over the states, and in consultation and with the support of DOJ, now has access whether or not a state or a subsidiary of a state opts in or out.
Great, thank you. Much more articulate. So essentially, New York did, in fact, the state of New York, under Andrew Cuomo, Governor Cuomo, did say that New York state was not going to participate in sharing fingerprints with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And on May 15th, 2012, Secure Communities was basically forcibly imposed upon and became active in New York City, which affects all of our communities. So essentially what started happening from my perspective, working in the courts every day, is that many more people who possibly could get arrested on a low-level offense would start getting these things called immigration detainers. They started popping up more. I'll just define what that is to make sure everyone's clear on that. Essentially, it's a request from immigration to a local authority to say, we know you have this person, when you're done with them, we would like to take them into custody because we have reason to believe they're either here unlawfully or their lawful status is jeopardized for something they have done, essentially. So this fingerprinting database allowed the immigration system to find out much more about who's coming through our local police precincts, our local jails. And what we have started to see happen is that immigration detainers would drop as early as arrest at a local police precinct, which was not generally happening before. I could say there, with a few exceptions. So the rollout of Secure Communities has changed very greatly our practice in from a criminal defense perspective, because now the concern of immigration becomes much more. It used to be really an issue that would come up if someone in fact went to Rikers Island. And now it's becoming an issue as early as arrest and even at arraignments. So our strategy has had to be very carefully rethought so that someone is not given over to immigration when they could not be, or there's a way to resolve the case. And we'll talk a little more in detail about what Commissioner Schriro talked about, that New York City has made very great efforts to try to limit the cooperation as a result of SCOM, and when in certain instances people are not turned over. But by and large, that is how immigration is getting most of the people they're finding. And a lot of the people we see are people arrested with no criminal history whatsoever. This is a first arrest for for often low-level offenses, often which are actually interrelated to the immigration situation. For example, driving with a suspended license, not having a license, having a fraudulent ID to work. So a lot of the offenses are in fact related to your status. So that's definitely the biggest funnel. And I think last year, I'm not sure you would know the figures better, but I believe about 4,000 people were turned over from the criminal justice system here in New York. And with the rollout of ESCOM and more detainers, that may be going up, but I'm not sure.
I can tell you it was 1,206 from the department. So,
throughout the whole year?
well, this is actually, so this was a first year reporting. There's some material out there. So it's not a complete year. It's March through September. So about a half a year.
6 months.
Yeah, so if you double that, maybe it would be 2,400.
But that's definitely the way most people end up in the system, through the criminal justice lens.
That's that. Sorry. That's it? Oh, I have a figure here of 2,800 New Yorkers are deported. You know, we're seeing something very, very similar. We don't know. I have one particular case that we're working on connected with the universal representation campaign that we're seeking. This is an individual who came to this country, was petitioned by his U.S. citizen wife. Something happened with the petition. There was some kind of problem that happened. They didn't have an attorney. They found an attorney. The attorney gave bad advice and said, because he was given a choice, and the attorney said, just take the voluntary departure. You're not going to have any option to be able to seek this petition through your U.S. citizen spouse. So he took the voluntary departure. His wife had a child. He decided he's not going to leave, and he stayed in the United States. He stayed for years. Then he was in a visiting friends in a public housing unit. And there's a program called Clean Halls. Are people familiar with Clean Halls? So the Clean Halls is the partnership between NYPD and HUD. I believe it's with New York City HUD, that says that if the NYPD has the right to ask for ID of anyone who is on the premises of public housing, or even it could be private housing that has Section 8 housing, Section 8 vouchers. So he was there with a group of people. Everyone was arrested. All the charges were dropped, but he was the only one in the group who actually then had a detainer on him. We don't know if it was Secure Communities. We think it was Secure Communities, and he was shipped off to New Jersey. And he called our office, and we answered the phone call, and as he told the story, it was clear he had ineffective assistance of counsel, and if he had an attorney now, he could very well win his case. He's been sitting in jail in detention for 6 months. His boss at his restaurant, he works at a organic restaurant. His boss he has a following. He's such a great chef. He has a great following. The business has gone down because he himself, was a very good cook and was instrumental in that business. The boss is waiting for him to get released, because even at least if he could be released and having an attorney would at least get him released, and then he could fight his case outside of detention. That would be good for the business and clearly good for his family and his U.S. citizen child. And so he is now working with Cardozo Law School, and they are actually right now in the process of seeking his release. But he is an example of, and I'm sorry, let me just go back a little bit. Once he was detained, his family found an attorney. The attorney charged $2,000 and did nothing. So once Cardozo took the case, now they're working on it, and there's a possibility that he may be able to be released. But here's an example of where you have a program in Secure Communities and individuals who are being impacted in a way where they have absolutely no ability to argue their case, which is why we need a universal representation program.
Angela, you talked a little bit about how the effect of this one gentleman who is in detention has expanded to his community. It appears to have had some economic effect in his workplace. But broadly, what do you see as the community effect of removing an individual from that community through deportation or through the detention that precedes it, whether it's practically, whether it's psychologically, whether it's socially, any of those effects?
So this is something that we see all across the city, the everyday impact. If you think about these calls that we've described, having someone call us from a detention center saying that they're facing deportation, the people that we're interacting with are not only the individuals who are detained, but it's their families here in New York City who are being affected. And the numbers are constantly changing. On one hand, we have these new policies that limit the use of detainers, both from the city side as well as from ICE, but we know that detainers are still being used in our city's jails. A report that I think we will link to the website for this panel that the clinic worked on with the Immigrant Defense Project and Families for Freedom, called Insecure Communities, Devastated Families, that took data from 2005 until 2010 and showed that, again, we're talking about numbers in the range of 34,000 New Yorkers who were picked up by ICE. And once you are detained for all of the reasons that were described, 91% of those New Yorkers were deported. And if you think about the families, and we have statistics here about the sheer number of children, and this is reporting by any agency is a little bit, can be spotty for various reasons. ICE does not necessarily have complete records in terms of the people who are being detained and deported, what their relatives here in the U.S. are. But from the incomplete records, again, we're talking about thousands of U.S. citizen children who are affected right here in New York City. And it, like any other reentry problem, when you're talking about a justice system, those problems manifest here. So you're talking about foster care for children. And our clinic at NYU has represented individuals who are sole caregivers, were detained as a result of a detainer into the immigration system, and their children had to be placed in foster care. And there are certainly policies and measures that the government has tried to put into place to address these issues, but they're always ad hoc and incomplete because we haven't seen change at the federal level. But when you look at these families, foster care being one dramatic example, but there are certainly situations where you have another parent who becomes the sole caregiver. You have families that have to turn to public benefits and welfare to make up for the loss of a breadwinner. You have children who are doing poorly in school in terms of their ability to deal with the fact of a loss of a parent. Many of the issues that touch upon concerns in the criminal justice system also affect immigrant detainees because they're held in the same facilities. So if you think about visitation policies and the telephone rates, the ability to call your loved one each day, to speak with your loved one, particularly again for New Yorkers who are now being detained in New Jersey and Louisiana and Alabama, what that means for the family unit here in New York City. We see those issues spread across the city. And they have very dramatic effects that are felt by people long after the deportation case is over, for better or for worse.
I can just jump in. The fear of discovery, whether it's yourself or somebody else in your family that might be identified in the process, really has a chilling effect on crime in the community as well. Individuals are so much more vulnerable to being shaken down. If there's domestic violence in the home, they're going to be more reticent than ever to make a report, seek an order of protection, and so it puts the whole community at a disadvantage for perfectly understandable reasons, but it makes them that much more vulnerable to all sorts of abuses.
And to piggyback on that, I mean, two things. What the commissioner just mentioned, I had learned of an anecdote of a woman who was undocumented, and she had U.S. citizen children, and there's a fire that started in her kitchen while she was cooking, and the fire started. She actually was terrified to call the fire department, because in her mind, the fire department was the same as the police, is the same as ICE. She put the fire out herself. I mean, and it was fortunately a happy story, or not a tragic story. But that's just just to give you a point of view or perspective on what an individual can be thinking and how they're perceiving all government agencies, and so that chilling effect can have a great impact. One thing I did want to say is Dr. Phoenix Arias, who teaches here at John Jay College, did a great study on the impact of deportation on children. And one of the things that she identified, many things, but one of them was actually obesity rates of children whose parents have been deported is significantly higher than children whose parents haven't been deported, and that leads into the health. There's serious health consequences besides the also educational consequences. There's been in her study she also showed that there's a precipitous drop in their grades of children whose parents have been deported, and they have this real sense of alienation from their own country because this is their country. Yet their country is the cause for a parent being exiled permanently from the United States. So I think that we need to think about what does that mean in the long term for these children and the sense of who they are within the United States when they experience this.
So I will mention that there's a selection from the study by Dr. Arias that Angela mentions that is in the book that's on display over here. So if that's of interest to folks, go ahead and peruse it. I think in the interest of time and in the interest of making sure that the audience has an opportunity to ask any questions that are on their minds, I'd like to sort of end with a question here that is about accountability. I think what I heard that was interesting and quite disturbing, frankly, is that that Secure Communities, which is a data sharing agreement, it doesn't sound like it's much of an agreement at this point. It sounds like, despite the will of New York State's executive and what appears to be the popular will of the people of the state, this program has in fact been imposed upon New York State and New York City, and is having what appears to be a fairly dramatic impact on communities and families around the city and around the state. So in terms of accountability for these processes and how they are carried out, who does an interested individual approach? Who are the agencies that we could approach in terms of advocating for better policy? Who are the individuals that we could approach for advocating for better policy? If you wanted to give our students some information on the right people to press and the right people to share their opinions with, who would those people be?
So I'll jump into that because that's a lot of the work that we do. So I think that individually going to an elected official is not as effective or as powerful as joining either an organization or a community of people that has been doing a lot of thought, has been involved in a lot of thought about this, and a lot of research as well when approaching a target that you've identified as someone who could really affect change. When Secure Communities came into New York, and we as an organization, along with Immigrant Defense Project, Families for Freedom, many other organizations here in New York State, we had our antenna up. We said, we know Secure Communities is happening across the country. And we wanted Governor Patterson to tell us before he signed an MOU, inform us, because we'd already been having meetings with him on other issues. And with no information, no one was told, New York State signed that MOU with the Department of Homeland Security. And that's when the campaign started. And that's when we built a coalition with other organizations from around the state, faith, victim services, unions, and went and had a meeting with DCJS, which was the entity that signed the MOU. And that was the beginning of a multi-year campaign that led to Governor Cuomo deciding to pull New York State out of this program. That didn't happen because he himself woke up one morning and said, I'm going to do this. I mean, this happened because of group organized community pressure. So I guess generally what I would say is, if there's a particular topic that interests you, I think you can reach out to any of us here on the panel, and we can tell you which organizations are taking the lead in working on these campaigns. This universal representation campaign, we're working on it with Cardozo Law School, Center for Popular Democracy, and Vera Institute, that's focusing most of their energy on this with our other partner organizations. But there are other similar campaigns that we can direct you to the right organizations that are doing that work. Go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Going through organizations, learning more, and finding where you're best able to plug in is the best approach. And I do also want to say, being in New York City, we are particularly lucky in this fight, I would say. And I think, we have, in that we have, at least with the two laws that we've talked about, which are seeking to improve upon the forced imposition of ESCOM, that was many groups here today going to speak with City Council about this very issue, and that, in fact, if ESCOM is implemented as just laid out, every single person could be turned over, literally someone picked up on a minor open container offense, right? Which didn't seem to be in line with public policy here in New York City. And through a lot of advocacy as well, a lot of sitting around the table, and through community members, the City Council responded and enacted these two laws, which are, as other localities are now starting to mimic, some are doing different variations of that. But I say that to say that I do think there's an opportunity in this city to move things along, as well as the Universal Representation Project. City Council has funded a certain amount of money to at least start a pilot project.
And that's a victory of ours. It's $500,000, which would help. Sorry, should have said that's one of the victories. We, started this campaign and were able to have City Council earmark $500,000, which will help approximately 130 immigrants that are detained right now, and that program will start in October. So that's an example of how you can do these campaigns that have victories.
And that being said, I do think in New York City, there is an electorate that is, I think, willing to hear what we're saying, and we've worked very closely, with the Department of Correction around this law, and been getting good, working relationships and getting people, out who should be out. So I say that to say that, so there's a lot of great opportunity here in the city, but really I think who to hold accountable, I think without the federal government changing, without Congress acting to change these laws, or on a federal level through executive order or action, to in fact change the implementation of the detention system and the laws that are making people subject to mandatory deportation and detention, it's Band-Aid work. And so not to be sort of a downer, I just think it's really important that the accountability really comes down to the federal system, and the way in which that's being implemented, and change, I believe really needs to happen there.
I'd like to add, there are two policies that don't need laws to change, because I'm not very hopeful that much is going to change in the law, at least this year. But there are two big policies that affect a lot of people. The first is, I was referencing before, the general characterizations about we only detain the most dangerous of the dangerous. But pressing ICE to specifically identify what kinds of crimes and criminal histories they're going after is, I think, really critical to seeing who they're going after. And once you get a commitment and they're high enough felonies, then it's really easy to spot everybody who would fall below that and focus there going forward. The other, so that's really an ICE-driven conversation, and you would get to it through all the organizations that have been mentioned, and your targets would be the members of Congress, particularly on the committees that ICE and Homeland Security would go before. And the other is Congress has taken this unusual tact, at least in the appropriations process, that we appropriate these many dollars for 34,000 beds a day, and by golly, you're going to fill 34,000 beds a day. Well, I have to tell you, I've run state correctional systems and city correctional systems, and we get appropriated money for beds, but nobody has taken that to mean that every bed has to be kept full. And usually if there are empty beds and you can shut down housing units or whole facilities, people, let out a cheer. New York State has closed facilities. They've announced that they're closing more facilities. And so pressing them to only use the beds that are needed, and again, needed would be in the context of who is the most dangerous of the dangerous, which unfortunately for the moment is also going to include those who must be mandatorily detained. But those two things would really take the temperature down, and they don't need changes in law.
So I would just add that, certainly we want to see change at the federal level, but in waiting for that change, as people are fighting for that change at the federal level, we in New York City and in New York State can do much better. Every city and locality can send a signal to the federal government by the work that they do within their power to make changes. And we've seen that across the country. States and localities have passed some very terrible anti-immigrant legislation to send a signal. Well, New York City and New York State, which claims to be home to immigrants, can do much better on all of these fronts. While the detainer policies that have been passed forth by the City Council have been a great step in the right direction, they don't go as far as they could. There are other localities in Newark, in New Orleans, in other places across the country that are saying as close as they're able to of a policy of no detainers, honoring no detainers. Instead of for us to try and make characterizations of who's truly the worst of the worst or the dangerous of the dangerous, there's not a person that I have met that when you hear their full story, you can put it down to one label and say, well, you deserve to be deported, but your neighbor doesn't. These are questions of fundamental due process and discretion, and when that's not in the federal immigration system, we as a city and state should not be funneling anyone into that system when they can stay here in their homes and communities and fight it out the best they can with the resources that our city and state are willing to offer. So going further with our detainer protections and thinking more about inclusion, in this mayoral race in the spotlight, there's been a lot of promises and talk about what we'll see, what the city's going to do. And when you think about licenses, when you think about funding for undocumented students to pursue higher education, when you think about policies that will help people get deferred action status, ways of preventing these issues from occurring, educating people, and stopping the detainer pipeline, those are some of the things that the city can really expand upon, and the state can take a leadership role in this through the work of community organizations. So all of us can be part of that while we continue to pressure the federal government to make changes as well.
So we do have a little more time, and I would like to make sure that our students, faculty, and community members get a chance to answer any questions that have come up for you as you've been listening to our panelists speak. So if anyone has questions in the audience, please do raise your hands. Because this event is being recorded, I'll give you two options. You can either come up here and speak into the mic, or if you're not feeling like doing that, I'll kind of paraphrase and repeat your question for you so we can get it recorded. Sorry, in the middle here. Okay, so my understanding, Leo, of your question is what resources or what protections do individuals who are undocumented have that they can bring to bear on the process before they might encounter the criminal justice system for something like driving without a license or something related to their status that might bring them into contact with the criminal justice system?
That's a tough question, and my clients, ask me that, and I think about that a lot. It all changed around. You used to be able to get a driver's license in New York if you were undocumented. That changed. I'm not sure exactly of the year. I think it was around 2005. I don't know if anyone knows, but that's really tough, and a lot of people are working as drivers, and I've, worked a lot with clients who feel that's the best, maybe they worked in construction for many years, and driving is really, for them, it feels safe, a safer field, that they're physically able to do it. It works with the other demands in their lives. It's really hard. I mean, people can go to their consulates and get consular IDs. So New York City also has a policy, the NYPD, as a general policy, which again, this could be changed as well. If someone does not have ID on them, no matter what, it's an automatic arrest. Because they can't identify the individual, there's different reasons as for why that's the policy. I don't know. I don't believe that's the policy in all localities. I'm not sure. So that's one thing. I think it's a tough balance, because having identification can be good in some instances and not in others. So, it's a really hard question to how to live your life in a way that you're never going to have any contact. I mean, of course, driving without a license, knowing that that's not something you can do, but also for a lot of people, it really is a survival tech. I had a client who worked in construction, and he told me, I literally make double the pay if I can dry the supplies. And I have 2 kids. One of my kids has a lot of health problems. And so I drive the paint and wood, and I fill it up in my car because I get double my salary. So for him, it didn't feel like a choice, even when something that might seem, why wouldn't, people say, why wouldn't you work in another field? And that it's really not that simple. I don't know what else people could really do to sort of alleviate that in terms of those. I think being aware that you can get arrested for something very minor and have serious immigration problems. I think there needs to be more awareness around that within the community, because unfortunately, at least for now, that is the reality. And the systems are very, very interconnected. And that's something I try to educate my clients on and their family members.
I would just add that particularly with young people living in New York City, there are a number of organizations that are led by and for undocumented youth, such as the New York State Youth Leadership Council. There are a number of other groups also in the city where really youth can educate each other about the techniques that they've used, what kind of safety plan that you have to have in place if you are at risk of deportation, ways of trying to potentially get legal advice and appropriate legal services, because there are a lot of both attorneys and non-attorneys that do take advantage of the desperation that can come in this situation, so that people can get educated, as Talia mentioned. And it's also important, part of this has been the organizing that organizations like the one that Angela runs and others have done on these issues, because it's one thing like whether or not you're going to drive, that's a tough issue, and it's not really a choice for a lot of people. But as we know, a lot of the reasons that many of the immigrant organizing communities in New York City have fought so hard against programs like stop and frisk and clean halls is because it doesn't take even driving, it takes walking down the street in the city to come into contact with the police in many circumstances. And just like the criminal justice system, the majority of people who are affected by immigration policies are communities of color, and they're the same communities that have been stopped on the streets. And we'll see how those changes are going to be implemented, thanks to the work that community organizations have done on city council and with the litigation that's been done around things like stop and frisk. But that's why, at the end of the day, people have to get educated about what the targets are, where the risk areas are. But many of these organizations have come together to try and change some of these policies so that it isn't so easy to find yourself in a situation where you can be arrested or placed into immigration custody, and fighting against those things that otherwise would feel completely outside of our control. But in reality, through organizing, some of these policies can be changed so that not every interaction with law enforcement happens in these circumstances, and when they do, that they don't always lead to deportation.
Other questions? Sir.
So one of the overarching themes of our history panel tonight is humanity comes into play when you're trying to deal with these people that you immigrants that are so often looked as commodities of sorts by the justice system. And one thing that I really thought of before, the immigration or doing away with the current immigration system to make it easier for citizens. Now that we don't have that, how do we go about, in the court of law, when people get into trouble, communicating to those who are the arbitrators that these are people as well?
So I'm going to summarize what's a very dense and deep philosophical question by basically saying I think this is about humanizing law and a sense that the laws as they are on the books are not really recognizing of the humanity of the individuals who are subject to them. Is it fairly accurate? So I think as a general approach, how would you see the best way to go about humanizing this system?
I don't want to sound too negative, but the system itself is inhumane. And I think recognizing that from the beginning, when we sit with clients in detention and we're trying to explain to them what's going to happen, how it might take a month before they see a judge, if that, and that even at that point there may not be anything that the judge can do under the current law, that is a heartbreaking, nonsensical, irrational, disproportionate system. And when those individuals say, but I served my time, and isn't this double jeopardy? Or, that I have family members. Doesn't it matter that I have U.S. citizen children? And we have to say that the law doesn't recognize that. I mean, that is the reality. And I think acknowledging that is an important first step, and not to pretend that the law is just in the system. That being said, as lawyers, we're part of the system, and that's why, as we navigate and we challenge these things, there is not a Supreme Court decision on immigration that has been made that didn't start out as a completely losing argument. Everything that we've argued that the law says, we have had to fight tooth and nail to get a court to recognize it, and thousands of people get deported under that interpretation of the law before we finally get up high enough for someone to say, actually, no, that person does deserve a hearing. So we explain that to our clients. We say the law is terrible. It doesn't recognize what it's supposed to recognize. We will fight as hard as we can to try and enforce justice in the law. But it's very important for us to also work with community organizations to change the law. And that's the thing. At the end of the day, many of our clients have ultimately been able to get the right to stay here, not because of anything that we've done as lawyers, but because their family members took it to the streets, or they worked with community organizations, or an elected official got involved. So we recognize that and honor that part of the struggle, because that's the part that's going to create lasting change. We can win something in the courts, but then Congress will rewrite the law and it'll be a loser again, or we'll lose in the courts and get Congress to rewrite the law so it wins. But the power of people who are going through the system themselves, like the people who are in Northern Manhattan Coalition, people who are in Families for Freedom, people who are in these organizations that we've mentioned that are really by and for people who are going through it, they've been the one who fight for dignities for themselves and for their families. And as lawyers, we play a very small part in the process to push for change, and just in many ways just to bear witness to the fact that it is an inhumane system.
And thanks. And but I do want us to think about actually some of the ways in which laws have been humanized. So, for example, minimum mandatory sentencing with drug convictions. I mean, we've had a very big shift in that. I mean, part of it is definitely driven by economics, but to have the Attorney General Holder declare that this is something that should just not be continued, and in New York State, with the overturning of the Rockefeller laws a number of years ago. I mean, and that was a very positive step, and that was because of families coming together and demanding that these laws be more human. So it can happen, but it's a very long and slow process from really outside the system.
Sorry, Miss.
No, I know, it's a mouthful of words.
Are there any efforts from community or organizations or immigrant rights groups that are pushing for a local law that will provide publicly funded legal representation for artists, those who are in and what is the likelihood of that?
Okay, so I'm going to try and repeat as best I can. Is there any movement that you know of toward a local law which would mandate legal representation for immigrants facing mandatory detention? And the second part was, what is the likelihood of such a law being passed? And I would even add, is that even something that could be done at a local level or even up to a state level, or is that something that would be limited to federal jurisdiction?
So I can answer that. So actually right here, I have the front page's summary of the Katzman study that shows the data as to why we need a universal representation system. And then on the back, a little bit more information, and if you want to join, you can sign on and be part of this movement that all of us here at this panel are a part of in different ways and different levels. So just one little thing I did want to say: mandatory detention, deportation. I mean, those, they're mandatory. The idea is having universal representation, so they actually get a fair shake. I mean, so someone can actually have a fair shake when they are up against, or they are presenting their case in front of a judge. This is not going to change that, but it's still going to help a tremendous amount of people. And so this has come out and has been created based on this research that was created by law practitioners. So it's a little bit different. It's not coming out of family members that are being impacted, and that's what makes it a little bit different. But you still need this data, and so the individuals who work in the community and saw what was happening, the research was done, and this data is very important because we can take this data to the elected officials. Now, when we go into those meetings, we are going with family members that are affected, that if they had free, high-quality attorney, their loved one would not be in mandatory detention or not be in detention right now, and could fight their case at least outside of detention. So the fact that we were able to get a certain amount of money allocated from City Council to do a pilot program is a very, very good sign. And the conversations that we've all been having at the state level, both at the executive and in the Assembly and in the Senate, that might be a little bit of a heavier lift, but I mean, it's all about what kind of movement we create and what kind of pressure we put on these individuals to demand this kind of program. So we're very positive and optimistic that this will be a likely first of its kind in the nation program in the state for the rest of the country.
But I just want to add to that, not to be a downer again, but that it's $500,000. It's a great effort, but this is only to address people detained whose cases are specifically held at Varick Street, which is here in Manhattan. And it's only for a very limited number of attorneys for a population, for a very high volume. So the issues, those of you that work in criminal defense work here in New York or have had exposure in other places, the volume and the need is so great. And also because people are detained in a setting where access to, for example, when my client is in criminal detention, I can video conference with them. I can have them produced to a courthouse 3 doors down from my office to sign waivers, to work on their case. When they're in immigration detention, I drive to see every single individual, sometimes 2 hours away. I can never video conference with them. So the reality of a universal model representation is an excellent one, and I want that very, very badly, but also thinking about as future, policymakers and people going into these fields possibly, the reality of what is needed to effectively be able to track down someone's birth document, a document from Honduras, or, the reality of finding family members, you may believe your mom's a U.S. citizen, and that could totally change your case. So things like that. So it's a definite, amazing first step, definitely first of its kind. But there's a lot of questions as to, and also, just to clarify the mandatory detention question, so you could argue I'm actually not subject to mandatory detention. That's where a lawyer could be helpful to say, actually, this conviction, immigration, you're saying this means I'm subject to mandatory detention, but your lawyer could make an argument to say, actually, that is not how this person should be classified. But all of that is a tremendous amount of work. So, you know, universal representation is an amazing idea. It's a very, very lofty goal, and the practicalities are great. The practical difficulties are great.
So, there are a number of other questions out there, but I do want to press this just a bit, in that this effort is coming at the city level. This funding is coming from the New York City Council. I'd like to just kind of ask again, what are the chances of getting this done at a state level in the absence of federal action on this issue? I would even add, in the likely absence of federal action on this issue. Is this something that the state could sustain in its budget? Is this something that the city could sustain in its budget? Is it possible to do outside of federal intervention?
So at the federal level, the bill that has been passed at the Senate does include language for universal representation, but only for children and individuals who have mental, that are mentally incapacitated, correct? Is that, yes. So even if there were, if this bill were to pass, it still would not help the thousands of immigrants that need this kind of assistance. So the total cost of this at the state level on a yearly basis is not very high at all. It's about $8 million. And when you compare it to the cost, the total cost, if we're just looking at economic terms, to the foster care system, to the children's health insurance program, to the education system, to the economic system in terms of the lost wages or the turnover that happens when a business loses a person, an employee, and to the detention and deportation system and having to retrain and hire someone. Those are costs. Then we look at the moral and the humanistic aspect. I mean, what kind of state are we as supposed to be the beacon of immigrants in the world? I mean, New York State. I mean, we're the state that has been welcoming immigrants for centuries. To then not have a program that is not costly at all and that actually really represents American values of due process and fairness. So I think it's all about how the research is presented, where the stories are elevated, the human stories that are elevated, and being able to have these conversations with those that are in those positions of power at the state level. I mean, Bill Lynch, who just passed away, who was a political I don't know what it's called, political operative, but I hate to use the word operative. But I mean, he was responsible for Dinkins winning the mayoral election. He was responsible. I think he worked on one of the Clintons' campaigns. I think it was the Senator Clinton's campaign when she was in New York. And he was very good at working and getting legislatures to vote on laws. And they would ask him, "How did you do it? How did you get this law that looked like no one was going to vote for it?" He said, "Education. Just sit and talk to people and explain to them what is the problem and what is the potential solution." So maybe I'm a cockeyed optimist, but I think that with the work that needs to be put in, I don't see why this couldn't be a reality in New York State.
I think we have time for one more. Miss, sorry. Okay, so the question is, do any of the organizations that that are represented up here work with the families of immigrants who have already been deported in a social services capacity, basically, helping with economic issues or the other kinds of issues that individuals would face, or the families of deported individuals would face post-deportation?
So our clinic represents community organizations, some of which do provide those services. For example, Families for Freedom is an organization that's led by and for immigrants who are in the deportation systems and their family members. And sadly, that has meant over the years that many of their most active members are the mothers and fathers of children who have been deported, or the spouses of individuals who've been deported and are raising their kids here in the U.S. and trying to make their families work, given the fact that the husband or the wife is now in another country, and in many cases is permanently barred from returning to the U.S. So they're an organization that certainly provides support with a focus on advocacy and organizing to bring those stories to light. There are some organizations that work with individuals who've been deported to try and think through ways of having them come back. The BC Boston College post-deportation project, and I believe someone from that project will be speaking with this initiative later on in the semester as well. And we've worked with individuals who've been wrongfully deported, where we can find a reason that there was a problem in the first deportation proceeding, to try and bring them back, which is incredibly difficult and challenging. It can take years, if that, and even at that moment, often when immigration officials may acknowledge their past mistake finally, they then say, well, the person can come back, but they'll be detained for whoever knows how long while we sort this out. Or, present problems with giving documents and papers for people, even those who win their cases, to then get their right to the hearing that a court has acknowledged. So we've done work on that issue from a legal standpoint as well.
I think we have time for about one more. Okay. Sure, sir. Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cam Salomon, and I'm from Haiti, and traveled to Canada. So from Canada to Paris, and Paris back to Canada, and moved to the United States. So I am a Canadian citizen. Then for the past 27 years, I got my green card. And in 2000, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and I can find a job on my skill. And I made a mistake, and I paid for my mistake. I went to jail because I make a copy of my taxi driver license. Then I go to jail for one night, and I go on probation. For 2 years, everything was clean. And I'm a good moral person, and I pay taxes for so many years in America. Then, last December, I went to see my father in Canada, crossing the border. My green card was expired 5 days before my returning to the United States. And when I get stopped by one of the officers, he said, where do you live? I said, well, I live in the United States, but I just came from Montreal visiting my father for his sickness. He's blind and Alzheimer. Then he said, why you don't live in Canada? Of course, I said, yes. I don't live in Canada, but I travel to Canada to visit my parents, especially my father who is sick. And he said, do you have a green card? She doesn't ask me for a green card. I give her my Canadian passport. She went through the system. She found that I went to jail, but I pay the jail time and probation, everything. I pay $500. So, but I got the disposition from the court. He said that, what do you want to do? You want to lose your green card or you lose your citizenship? I said, well, neither one. She said, no, you have to go back to Canada or you lose one or not. I said, I'm not going to lose either one. Do you have a lawyer? No, I said, I don't have a lawyer. Do you think I could take you to jail now? I said, so do I have a warrant against me? She said, no, I don't have a warrant against you. If I got a warrant against you, you should be in jail. And after 12 hours sitting down at the border, so she has to go home because her shift time is over, so another officer took over the case. And I went to interrogation. They searched me if I got cocaine, you never been in drug. No, I said, check my system. I'm never involved in drug anything. And they said that, okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to send you to Federal Plaza and before to see a judge. I say, okay, no problem. It took me about 9 months before I saw a judge, which is last week, and the judge said, Mr. Salomon, you need a lawyer. I said, I have no problem, but I cannot afford to pay $8,000 in my case. And he said, okay, I'm going to reschedule your case, and you have to seek for legal advice things. So I went to Legal Aid Society, which is in the same building, 12th floor, where immigration judges are. Then they said, well, it's going to take 8 weeks to work through my papers until my case go back to the judge. So I would like to know. That's why my question is, I'm a clean guy, I've never been involved in drugs, nothing. And I'm a minister. So why this happened? And it was 2003 cases, long time ago. So I consulted a lawyer. She's told me, because you got a bad lawyer, went to your case in Atlanta, Georgia. That's why they could find you into the system. So what I have to do, according to you, because you are a member of the law. Thank you.
So just so I understand, sir, was your question about your individual case, or more broadly about the experience of being stopped at the border, the experience of having to pay for legal counsel? I'm trying to understand what your question for the panelists was. Okay. Okay. So in terms of insight on the gentleman's individual case, is it similar to cases that you've seen in the past?
It's a very common situation, and maybe we can discuss this after privately. But yeah, I mean, that raises the point, which we didn't talk about, context, traveling in and out of the United States, applying for citizenship that was mentioned, applying to renew your green card. Incredibly innocuous things can trigger all of a sudden something that happened 10 years ago, and those are all points of contact. So traveling is part of the education that people are aware of those things, and if there's any reason someone thinks maybe I shouldn't travel, you should definitely consult with an attorney before something like this horrible experience could happen to you.
Yeah, I think the travel thing cannot be overstated. We try to have workshops before the end of the year, before the Christmas holiday, and we try to also before Easter to educate the community that if there is anything in their history, to consult with an attorney before traveling, because we know people who have green cards who've been traveling in and out of the country for years. They have an old conviction. We had one woman from 1994. She was at a party. They arrested everyone. She didn't use any of the drugs. She had nothing. It was the only arrest, the only conviction. That was in 1994. She'd been traveling in and out of the United States for years, and just 2 years ago, she came into our office and said, I came back in, and they told me, now they're telling me I have to go to a removal hearing. So that is something that that if you know any green card holders that are planning on traveling, have them think long and hard about their past history before they do that.
Okay, I think we're about out of time, so I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today.